Hello, Slim Overton here, and I am a member of the Portsmouth Museum and Fine Arts Commission. And I had the opportunity today, on behalf of Portsmouth Coffee Talk and the Slim Nation 101 experience, to attend a Portsmouth Museum's event. And that event was called Pray, Fight, and Flight, the Enslaved Black Family and Resistance, for presentation by Dr. Brenda Stevenson, who is a professor at UCLA, but she is also a former resident of the city of Portsmouth, born and raised in Cavalier Manor, went to Waters Junior High School, middle school now, and Craddock High School. But she is returned to Portsmouth to give a presentation during this Black History Month, and I had the opportunity to be there. As a matter of fact, a side note, I was in junior high school at Waters with her sister, Beverly Stevenson, and Beverly Harris now, and we were in the orchestra together for about 2 years. So what a full circle to be able to go to an event today on a presentation from her sister, Dr. Brenda Stevenson. And I got a chance to film most of it. So here we are, already in progress.
To be submissive. They didn't. They taught them to act like they were submissive, okay? To act as if they were submissive while they were quietly and privately resisted in order that they would continue to feel a sense of themselves and control for themselves. Beyond the gaze of owners, supervisors, and patrols, slave children learned to walk a fine line between maintaining one's humanity and agency while not annoying, angering, frightening, or disrespecting white authority figures, or at least not caught doing so. One of their first resistance lessons was to mask, that is, to hide as much as possible about themselves and others who were close to them. This invisibility was essential to their survival. As captive children grew into adolescents and adults, they learned how to recognize and factor in the consequences of rebellious or compliant behavior on themselves and their kin. Family ties often were at the root of an individual's defiance. It also forced, however, submission. Slaveholders understood that families were one of their most potent weapons they could use to control a bond's person. Disobedience often led to brutal punishments, but also threats to the well-being of one's children, spouse, siblings, or parents. So people could, for example, become threatened with selling family members off if a person didn't obey, if a person didn't meet their work quotas, etc., etc. Enslaved adults realized that resistance occurred on a continuum that extended from the smallest act of personal rebellion to full-scale community-wide revolt. So too did white authority understand that a Black refugee could become part of a Maroon society, as we saw in the Dismal Swamp, for example, and how Maroons might plot and sponsor rebellion and revolution. Again, Virginia is at the forefront of what we think about. We think about slavery in the American South. If we look at slave rebellion, everybody knows about Nat Turner. You know, for example, there were other slave rebellions that took place in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, from the colonial period forward. As early as 1691, the colonial legislature of Virginia passed, quote, an act for suppressing outlying slaves, knowing that many times, and I'm quoting here, Negroes, mulattoes, and other slaves unlawfully absent themselves from their masters' and mistresses' service and lie, hid, and lurked in obscure places, creating a life for themselves and families that their enslavers could neither control nor extract benefit. Again, talking about Maroon societies. Okay. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about religion and resistance. Okay, this is just, I'm glad I came across this image because I showed you the first image of maroon societies in the Dismal Swamp, and this is another image of a maroon family in the Dismal Swamp. And one of the professors at William & Mary, and I can't remember his name right now, but he's done extensive archaeological work in the Dismal Swamp, and he has been able to actually find exactly where little villages of enslaved people who had run away and actually established themselves in villages, they have started growing crops, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And what would happen is that there'd be raids from the militia, and there'd be raids for soldiers or the local policing forces, and people would scatter, but then they'd reconnect deeper into the swamp and start all over again. And so here is an image of a family here. But again, you see in the background, these people are searching for them, if you can see, through the forest. So they're never secure in what they're doing because there are always forces that are out trying to secure them. So masters and mistresses routinely regarded the resistance efforts of enslaved people as indicative of their moral shortcomings, rather than as a rational response to slaveholder mistreatment and immorality. However, many bronze people invested in belief systems that created a spiritual and cultural distance between themselves and their masters, and provided psychological support and resistance for them and their families, as well as noted here as for their families. So they're able to use their religious beliefs to help to protect their families, as well as to, particularly to protect them psychologically. So the religions of the enslaved varied greatly. Just show this photograph. This is Yarrow Marmont. Okay, he was an Islamicized enslaved person from South Carolina. Well, we know that 1/3 of the people who came to the Americas as enslaved people were Islamic in faith. Okay, and this is an example of one. In South Carolina, we have examples of people who came early on in the colonial period, stayed Islamicized throughout the colonial period, the early republic, and the antebellum period, and at the end of the Civil War were still Islamic in faith. And he's an example of a person who was still Islamic in faith, you know, and later into his life. So these religions vary greatly, with blended aspects of indigenous beliefs and rituals, Islamic, Protestant, and Catholic texts and practices. Examples of syncretic religious practices were flush in the Black Atlantic, including North America. Hoodoo and voodoo practice across the South drew on Yoruba rituals and beliefs and activities linked to the Mende peoples, Poro and San societies, the Congo. Of course, the first people who arrived in Hampton in 1619 were the Congo peoples, people from Angola and the Congo region. They maintained some of their religious beliefs. And Muslims were evidenced in South Carolina, along with Igbo practices that were well documented on Sapelo and other low country sea islands. I have to give a shout out to the Igbo because I am a descendant of Igbo peoples, and my daughter-in-law is Igbo. Moreover, as religious historian Albert Rabbitoe noted, conjure was not just a way to explain, quote, evil, but also a way for, quote, group doctors to invoke harm as well as to remove it. This sentiment certainly was appealing to people who otherwise had very limited control of the good and bad in their lives and those of their loved ones. So religion functioned as a way to also instill resistance and also instill rebellious activity among enslaved people, but also to comfort people when they were unable to openly rebel. Parents and family elders passed on these practices through their own actions and oral traditions in the form of autobiographical tales, recitations of conjure ingredients, ghost and animal stories, dream interpretations, and song. Did any of you all grow up with these stories? Because I did. My mom's from South Carolina, so they were not playing. Okay. They were using everything available to them to survive. Okay. Consider, for example, some of the evidence of the practice of Islam or some syncretic forms of one. One Low Country woman, historian Sylvia Diop, identifies as, quote, Old Lizzie Gray, explained of her religious belief that, quote, Christ built the first church in Mecca, and he gave his grave was there. So you can see the coming together of both religions when they're talking. She's talking about Mecca, and she's also talking about Jesus Christ at the same time. So this is a syncretic coming together of these different beliefs. Bilali Muhammad and his wife Phoebe, according to their children and grandchildren, made certain to pray with the sunrise and sunset, bowing to the sun 3 times, and then kneeling or mass to pray with their string of beads. Phoebe also wore a white veil from her head to her shoulders. She too did another Muslim woman named Daphne. Others remembered the African they called Old Israel, who wrapped his head in a white cloth and kept a hidden book, presumably a copy of the Quran, and that he brought out while kneeling on a mat and praying, also with the rising and setting of the sun. There was also Omar Ibn Said, enslaved in northern South Carolina, a learned man of Islam from Toro in Senegal, who could still quote and write in Arabic long passages of the Quran. Years after his capture and sale in 1807, he eventually came to know and practice Christianity, but never forgot his family or their faith and teachings, or the sheiks in his homeland. Recording his autobiography in the 1830s, he recalled that before capture at the age of 37, he studied Islam for several years, made several pilgrimages to Mecca, routinely fought quote-unquote infidels, prayed 5 times daily, and gave alms in gold, silver, seeds, cattle, sheep, goats, rice, wheat, and barley. So the importance of religion was part of a long family traditions derived from their African past and sustained through their enslavement. Bondspeople embraced religious beliefs, practices, and public demonstrations as central to their identities and kin relations. As a fundamental cultural marker that could be experienced visually and orally, religious beliefs and practice styles were some of the most portable and therefore enduring of cultural attributes, and potentially revolutionary ideology to enslave people across the generations. African women and men could and did transfer the ideal that religion was a central component of one's identity with them from Western Central Africa to the mainland colonies during the era of the African slave trade. And then again along the roadways from the upper South to the lower South. Again, Virginia is important when we look at the domestic slave trade because more enslaved people from Virginia were moved to the lower South and Southwest than from any other state. And then as part of the domestic slave trade in humans. Others renewed these beliefs when they arrived as part of the illegal African slave trade in the decades before the Civil War, since the African slave trade was made illegal in 1808. So Charles Ball recalled that his grandfather, the Ben Mall that I opened with today, continued to practice his traditional religion and took great pains to explain it to Charles. And this is the way we see the culture being moved from one generation to the other. You know, grandparents to their children, those children to their children, et cetera, et cetera. He prayed daily and sometimes multiple times when his workload allowed him to do so. Rejecting Christianity, quote, as, quote, altogether false, Ben recalled a, quote, holy man who had received his religious tenets from the true God in heaven, preached it on earth and recorded it in a book, a copy of which was kept in every family. So Ben continues to teach his grandson Charles about what life was like in Africa. And this also is a kind of form of resistance. That is not to allow oneself to lose one's culture, the culture that comes when one was a free person, for example, versus the kind of cultural attributes available to you when you were enslaved. All adherents had to express a deep, quote, love of country, charity, and social affection, avoid being cruel, remain sober, and be truthful. Ben's grandfather's faith also required, quote, tenderness to wives and children. And so again, Ben is teaching to his grandson the ways in which he should behave as an adult in the Black community that he's in. And in this way, he is providing him with an alternative view to life and behavior and sense of self than he would have received just as an enslaved person without such instruction. So the many children of Hannah and Kalina, both Igbos in the Low Country, likewise learned much about their parents' indigenous cultural lives from them, including religious rituals. Quote, they talk a lot of funny talk to each other, a past acquaintance noticed, and quote, and they is mighty, particularly about praying. They pray on the beads. So people are looking at them and talking about them and talking about the ways in which they practice their African traditions and not really understanding what they were doing. You know, but understanding for them that was religion. For us, it was not religion. That is, they used beads for divination purposes. Others recalled participation in African-influenced harvest rituals, harvest rituals that included praying, singing all night, and with the sunrise, we go out and dance to big beating on the drums. And this image is an example of a yam festival that took place among the Igbo of Western Africa. And so these traditions in smaller versions and less elaborate versions, of course, were some of the traditions that are spoken of here for people who were enslaved with these people. One noted that they shouted and danced in a circle, not only to drums, but also to rattles made from dried gourds with seeds in them, and to the beating of 10 plates. Harvest Festival, they call it. Families and fictive kin took part in this annual communal religious practice, similar in description to Igbo yam festivals. So Christian missionaries and ministers of various denominations continue to have potent competition from deeply embedded African religious traditions that were sources of Black diasporic pride, belonging, and knowledge that enslavers could not manipulate for their own purposes. Many complained of the, quote, heathenistic rituals, superstition, and idolatry that bonds people clung to despite their owners' efforts to rid them of this resource. Though certainly by the time of the American Revolution, some enslaved people in North America had become Christian converts, at least outwardly, or in conjunction with the retention of their traditional African and Islamic practices. Colonial missions like that of the French Huguenot Francis Lejeune in South Carolina. And this is a picture of him, Francis Lejeune, who tried to establish Christian missionary sites in South Carolina, particularly among the enslaved people of South Carolina. South Carolina is an interesting place to study slavery because it's the only state where the majority of the people were indeed Black people. 60% of the population in South Carolina was Black. And we see large numbers of Black people in Virginia. Some counties had 60% or more, but many counties did not. But South Carolina overall in their population had 60%. Columbia Williamsburg, for example, 2/3 of the population on and off was Black. So we know that there were places, particularly in this part of the state, where there were large numbers of enslaved people. So anyway, he tried to teach them the catechism, rituals, and religious counsel for free and enslaved people. The Reverend centered much of his counsel on trying to get, this is always funny to me, trying to get enslaved people to be monogamous, of course, because many people coming from Africa were polygamous and not monogamous. And can you imagine him trying to explain to somebody why you can only have one wife? You know, and they're like, oh my God, here it goes again. And not to dance, feast, and have merry meetings on Sundays. And I have this image beside him because this is a famous painting of a dance that was taking place among enslaved people in enslaved quarters in South Carolina. And so you can see people were getting down, you know. And so, of course, dance is also ritualized. It's sometimes part of religious. I love the fact that, you know, they have the banjo, for example, and the drum. The banjo, of course, is a West African instrument. You see the drum there as well. You see the people, there are couples that are formed, there are people who are dancing as well. And so I think it just gives you a sense of the kind of social lives that enslaved people had, even though we often just think about them as being brutalized, and of course that took place. But these people, like all people, were able to also find time and energy to enjoy themselves. And there's always one picture that I always show my students, and I'm gonna move away from the mic and show it to you. Your good brother is having a good time. And so, okay, this one was talking to this man. You know, but I also like the fact that you see the head is wrapped, and in Islamic society, you see the head wrapped with the white scarves like that too. But this man, it always cracks my class. Caught in the act and don't even care. Okay. All right. Okay, so in the British colonies, and there was some benefit, of course, to being Christian outside of the faith itself. In the British colonies, being a Christian could also mean, quote unquote, benefiting clergy that could spare one the death penalty if you were found guilty for a crime, for example, and it was your first offense. If you were a Christian, you could escape the death penalty. Similarly, Catholic conversion in Maryland, as among the Spanish and the French, there were other places in North America at the time, allowed for some marital and family familial protections. So too for those in the Dutch colonies who married in the Dutch Reformed Church, and we're talking about New York and New Jersey at that point. So, Christian adults, as those who adhered to their indigenous belief system, passed on the benefits of their faith to their children and other kin. The formerly enslaved woman Elizabeth, for example, who was born in 1766 in Maryland, spoke of the lifelong imprint of her parents' religious faith and teachings. Both were Methodists, and her father, quote, read in the Bible aloud to his children every Sabbath morning, end of quote. Elizabeth felt deeply God's presence in her life from the age of 5. Once separated from her parents, because she was sold from them, her mother comforted her by reminding her that God always cared for her. Her parents' teachings of Christianity helped Elizabeth to reject her utter sense of hopelessness. Quote, I betook myself to prayer, she explained, and in every lonely place I found an altar. Parents and other guardians also routinely surveyed the behavior of the quote-unquote holy and clergy. They privately condemned those who behaved immorally, both to teach their children the differences between right and wrong, so that they could also, but also so they would be able to psychologically resist the moral authority errant, that is, immoral whites claimed. In the 18th century, cases of physically and sexually abusive ministers sometimes ended in public court cases that captured the imagination of the larger community. In 1771, a Virginia priest proved to be an excellent public example of white moral failure to both local and white and black people. He was found guilty of several offenses, including drunkenness, exposing his private parts, and soliciting, quote, Negro and other women to fornication and adultery with him, end of quote. Now, Bethany Beanie's mistress in the early 19th century told the young girl that, quote, every little child that told a lie would be cast into a lake of fire and brimstone and would burn there forever and ever. And these are two pictures of Bethany Beanie. One is a drawing, of course, when she's much younger, and her autobiographical account is published. And one is a photograph of her when she's much older. This is after the end of slavery and all of that. So Bethany, she writes in her autobiography, quote, was dreadfully frightened and decided to take her concerns to her mother, who, despite her young mistress's claim to authority, still was the singular authority figure in Bethany's life. Bethany's mother told her that sinners will be punished, but, quote, those who told the truth and were good always, but always have something they should want, everything they should want, end of quote. The promise resonated deeply with Bethany, helping to provide her with spiritual and psychological wall against the hardships she faced while enslaved. Her mother's words of faith, she noted, quote, made a very strong impression on me. I believed every word she said, and from that day to this, I have never doubted its truth, end of quote. Such lessons encourage enslaved children to trust and obey the decisions of their kin rather than their enslavers, particularly at the time of resistance planning and implementation. Obedience and trust were essential if they were to be successful, regardless of if the plan was to escape, mount an armed revolt, create a maroon society, pilfer necessary food and clothing, murder or destroy property. Self-emancipators. No other form of documentation provides more insight regarding slave family resistance than enslaved escape notices and recapture advertisements published in the British, Spanish, Dutch, and French colonies in North America. And of course, this resonates with this history of the people who escaped, resonates really well with the people of Portsmouth and Norfolk and in this area, because so many people escaped, were able to escape from these areas. And of course, there's no notification in the city of Portsmouth for, you know, the Underground Railroad sites at the Black Church, for example, and on the coast, the sea waterfront as well. So I think this resonates very well. This is an advertisement that you see that was placed in 1758 by Landon Carter, one of the Carter family members, about the escape from my house in Richmond County, where Warsaw, Virginia is, if you're not sure where that is, from the Middle Peninsula. Sometime in August last, a tawny young Negro fellow named Will, very likely, what does that mean? Very attractive and sensible for a slave. He lived for many years at Ripon Hall near Williamsburg and was removed on account of his ill behavior. It is proposed he went to Ripon and carried off with him a young Negro wench named Sarah, his sister, and that they are gone to the eastern shore with a fellow named Peter, belonging to one of the Lee family on York River, who had been indulged by his master to work abroad or to work away from the plantation. Whoever will secure the said Will and Sarah so that they be delivered to me in Richmond County aforesaid shall have £5 cash besides what the law allows. Landon Carter. Okay. So this is just an example of the thousands of fugitive slave advertisements that you found in colonial newspapers throughout the American South and throughout North America in general. The thousands of recovery advertisements found in colonial and later newspapers, as well as the budding number of maroon societies in the swamps, mountains, and other physically isolated areas, document this very family-centered mode of resistance. So, the largest numbers of people who escaped were males, but we can, 2/3 of them. But 1/3 of them were female, and oftentimes the females did take their children with them. Oftentimes the males took their wives with them, or their sisters, as you can see from this advertisement. So this is a family event. So many colonial era refugees were Africans. The people who first arrived had no ties whatsoever with people who were here in this country and decided to, of course, escape. Who did they escape with? Other Africans who spoke the same language, who had the same cultures, okay? Recently separated from their homelands and families. A court in Louisiana ordered that a quote-unquote Bangor slave man who had just arrived on the ship and lived quite, quote, by the public executor because he repeatedly escaped and, when captured, had seized his master's gun. Surveys of enslaved people on the run in South Carolina between 1732 to 1782 indicated about 2/3 of those persons who escaped were Africans. A similar account of fugitives from Georgia for the period 1763 to 1775 documented 3/4 were African born. Some of the accounts from these eras also indicate that when Africans escaped in groups, they often did so with persons of the same ethnicity, most probably their first victim kin relations in the colonies. Quote, 2 lusty New Negro fellows in Georgia, for example, escaped together from their owner Joseph Gibbons in 1765. Quote, 2 Mandingo men and 1 from Guinea managed to get away from James Lawrence in Charleston, South Carolina in 1774. Some who had managed to marry and have children in the colonies escaped from them. In 1777, 3 African male and female couples, 5 individuals designated as being from the, quote, Guinea country, and 1 male from the Kisii country escaped together from their owner in Georgia. Enslaved men and women usually escaped in attempts to reunite with family from whom they had been separated, or to seek freedom as couples, families, and fictive kin groups. Refugees left on their own with a child, sibling, or spouse, few others from their quarters, and sometimes in larger groups. Barbary in South Carolina ran away with her young child who was not yet walking. Frances supposedly went to her husband, whom her master believed was, quote, harboring her. In Louisiana, Timber routinely escaped, quote, to sleep with a negress called Mariana, end of quote. Sylvia was believed to escape to her mother, who recently had been sold. John Jones estimated that 2 of his fugitive men, 20-year-old country-born Joe and 18-year-old African-born Tom, who still had his country marks on his cheeks, returned after 6 months to get 10-year-old James. Some, like Tom, who had parents on George Washington's plantation and was still in that vicinity 1 year after his escape, lingered even longer near loved ones to try to take them to freedom or to seek their protection from slave catchers. Okay, so I just wanted to stop for a moment and show, as I said, these images which I got offline. One of them from the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Portsmouth that we know was the site of the Underground Railroad. And then also, what I thought was really interesting and had not seen before, I went looking for, was this whipping post from Portsmouth, which was used as a way of punishing enslaved people who had escaped and done other sundry crimes, etc. And here is a picture supposedly of it, although I because of the soldiers' uniforms in the background, I don't really think it's from Virginia, probably from some other place in the Americas, but nonetheless the whipping post is very similar to the one that was in Portsmouth. And so Isaac and Isabel escaped with their child once they arrived from New York in Charleston, where they were to be sold. A group of 10 slaves, including their mother Affie and her 8-year-old son Peter, escaped from captiveship in Charleston Harbor that was carrying them from Baltimore to the Spanish Caribbean. And 9 persons left the Georgia plantation of James DeBow in 1770, 3 men, 3 women, and 3 children. Sancho, Warwick, Bella, and Phoebe, all from the same quarters in Virginia, and no doubt either friends, family, or both escaped together in April 1738. So it goes on, and of course we know that large numbers of enslaved people escaped from this area of Virginia during the American Revolution and also the War of 1812. Not only did refugee couples and family units abscond together, some imagined coupling within the context of their escape plans. Millie, a South Carolina bondsman, tried unsuccessfully to induce a black woman living on a nearby farm to go off with him. She said no. Okay. When she refused, he managed to convince another woman, he was a biggie, from those quarters, Hannah, to do so, promising to bring a horse to help her with their escape. Quote, Hannah went out and was has never been since seen or heard from by her owner. Billy was later caught, but not Hannah. He was executed for aiding her escape. More than a few masters realizing that men desired wives purchased women as potential spouses for their bondsmen, hoping that doing so would prevent their prime male workers from leaving. James Sterling in Detroit, for example, purchased 2 black women in 1764 in order to induce his, quote, 2 big Negroes from absconding. Okay, so I'm going to see what time it is, and I'm going to skip over a little bit of this so we can get to our discussion before it's too late. I want to just get to one ending. Let's see. All right. Now, this is from Petersburg, Virginia, and so I'm going to end with this story. When the enslaved man Fortune and his wife Aminta, and this is the advertisement for their escape that you see up here on the screen, decided to flee the bustling market hamlet of Petersburg, Virginia, for freedom, they could not have anticipated the course of events that would punctuate their lives as fugitives in Philadelphia, which is where they went, in service to the loyalist cause. Only a few years later, the cause of the British during the American Revolution, and eventual freedom in the northern British province of Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. Aminta and Fortune prepared for a free future, even though they knew that the odds were, as ever, stacked incredibly against them. Having recently been brought from Rhode Island, they had not put down any kin roots in Virginia. So this is a husband and wife who are coming from, who were sold from Rhode Island to Virginia. As a couple who would soon be parents themselves, she was pregnant. Perhaps the reason that they decided that they had no time to waste because they wanted their child to be born in freedom, they took to the open road, or water, perhaps they escaped by water, as clandestine hunted fugitives. Aminta and Fortune dressed as would be expected of free people, not enslaved people. Indeed, the quality and quantity of their clothing that they had at their disposal indicates that even as bondspeople, they had been valued, perhaps skilled people. William Bradley, their new captor, or their master in Petersburg, seemed well aware of their unusually rich bundle of clothing, which he described in detail for the fugitive slave advertisement. You can see in here that he talks about all the kinds of clothing that they could be wearing, etc. And indeed, there was a lot more clothing than typically enslaved people would have: a red flannel petticoat, a dark calico gown, a blue and white one as well, an old light-colored colors of one too, a red cardinal and black bonnet, and several other things, etc., etc. And so he also describes what they looked like. They see that the man had buckskin breeches, a thick coat, a brown sailor's jacket, a red greatcoat or big coat, a fine hat, etc., etc. Stockings, so they had a lot of, clothing. It was quite unusual for enslaved people. So the 40-year-old Fortune had buckskin pants that were almost new, 2 heavy coats, a sailor's jacket, and a large brimmed hat that he wore, and a cap for warmth, and maybe even a silk one. Regardless of his escape route, Fortune would not have appeared as a frightened enslaved man out of place with free people. He would have looked confident because of the way in which he dressed, and competent on his way to some place where he was expected. Amina, a 30-year-old mixed-race woman with, quote, the look of an Indian, and described in part from an indigenous person who had been brought from a Spanish colony. She wore her long black hair on her neck, also carried with her costumes of an elite domestic or free woman, numerous items of dress, as I read out earlier, etc. The couple had claimed to be free Now, it could have been that they were free and had been stolen and sold into slavery, which often happened. But anyway, they were able to get to Philadelphia, and they were able eventually to be able to move with the British loyalists up into Canada. Their daughter, Rose, was born in 1774 in Philadelphia, traveled with them and other refugees to British Nova Scotia. Despite the many difficulties that loyalist free blacks suffered, Rose Fortune, her father's quote-unquote slave name became the family's surname in freedom, grew up, married, had children, at least 3, and she had a business. She began, okay, this is a picture of her. She began a baggage carriage business that gained her public recognition and some respect. Rose also became an unofficial policewoman, helping to keep Halifax safe for her community, and she did have a community. In fact, the Fortune family came to be close to another group who had dared to leave Virginia with the British for freedom, also eventually in Nova Scotia. In the 1830s, 2 of Rose's children, Jane and John, married siblings Isaac and Hester Godfrey. Now that was part of the Godfrey clan that came out of Norfolk that escaped during the American Revolution and became part of the Ethiopian regiment as well. The Fortune family eventually even extended even more to include the connections that took place when Rose's daughter Margaret married John Francis. These 3 married couples gave Rose Fortune at least 8 grandchildren and a host of future descendants who today live in both Canada and the U.S. The family that Fortune and Anita could only have dreamed of when they escaped came to be and to thrive. Indeed, one of their descendants, Doreen Lewis, here she is, was the first black person to become a mayor, okay, in Canada. Wow. So enslaved family resistance not only mattered, but it also sometimes succeeded spectacularly. And that's the end of my presentation today. I look forward to your questions.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you.
Okay, I just want to get it in because sometimes I forget it. But anyway, welcome home, as the mayor said, welcome home. And I'm here because of 2 reasons. Of course, the Coffee Talk, we want to film this, and plus, I was in school, in junior high school, with your sister Beverly. And,
that's right, you are.
She let me know that you were coming in town, so I had to be here.
Thank you.
And of course, we were in the orchestra.
That's right, you were. What did you play?
I played the cello.
Yeah. Oh, she played the cello too,
yes,
so okay, you all sat beside each other.
Yes, indeed.
She did abuse us with the cello.
And I did the same thing at my house. My house as
My mother
well.
used to always say, why did she choose that? But anyway, thank you.
Yes, indeed. My question is, and thanks for your presentation. The information is so important. I always learn, and I've been here over 70 years, and I always learn from this history. My question to you would be, with certain factions trying to erase some of our history, you know, in the museums or for whatever reasons, well, we know the reasons, but anyway, what would be your advice to the general public or the audience here about how we can continue to share those messages? And of course, you mentioned your mother being from South Carolina, they made sure they passed down the information. So, but what would be your advice that we can do to make sure, with all the efforts being made to erase some of that history or to tone down it, what would be your advice for us to continue to share that message?
Well, I think that the history is really important. Of course, I feel that way because I'm a historian. I never thought I was going to be a historian. I went to UVA I was pre-med at UVA until organic chemistry, and I became a historian. But I think the important thing is to tell the history to each other, not just to young people, but to older people as well. so that everyone can share in the history. I think there's a lot of really wonderful history of all kinds of people found online. Make sure it's from a reputable source, but it's very available. It's available in print form or also in video form, and I think it's important to take advantage of that. Too, there are online courses that are given in various forms of history, including African American history, that are free. I think reading groups are really good too for older adults who may be retired and want to be, involved and invested. I think also teaching the history as part of everything that you do, whether or not you're in a sorority, whether or not you're in a church group, whether or not you're in a reading group, whether or not you're in a fraternity, whether or not you're in the Masons, etc. Take every opportunity to teach the history. Don't be afraid to, if people ask questions that they ask, to point them to the internet. That is what it is for, And so I think those are the kinds of things that you do, and then stand up for the history. If somebody says, well, we don't need to know that stuff, say, yeah, we do. You don't have to get into a big argument about it or brawl about it or anything like that, or embarrass my husband as I did the other day when I was correcting someone. But you can stand up for it. You can, yourself quietly, politely, say, well, that's really not true, is it? And you should check your sources or something like that, And then also just continue to believe that the history is important ourselves. I think sometimes, because, we live in a crisis-driven society right now. There's so many things happening every day. There's something new to consider or whatever. It begins to slip in terms of priority to the back of our mind. But try to keep it more towards the forefront of your mind and to teach it whenever you can and encourage other people to learn it. The internet is really great for history of all forms. It just is a treasure trove. Again, you have to make sure that the source is an accurate source, so check who's writing it and how they would know about it, etc. But that's the way that I go. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Welcome home.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back before James. Timothy Street.
Oh my God, that's right. Were you my neighbor?
Yes.
Oh my God, wonderful. Right, we started off, my family started off on Timothy Street in Truxton section of Portsmouth, and I went to Truxton Elementary School.
All right now.
Right, yes. What is your last name? Oh, you're Miss Montgomery's daughter?
That's right.
Oh, man, that's wonderful. So, yeah, we'll talk. At any rate, right, the Montgomerys lived on my street, on Timothy Street, and we also went to Ebenezer Baptist Church together, too. You look so much like your mother.
Everybody tells me.
That's true. When you said Timothy Street, I said, it's got to be a Montgomery, is what I thought to myself. Right, wonderful. Thank you. Great to see you.
We'll talk.
Okay, wonderful.
Good evening, my name is Whitney Richards, and
Hello.
I'm to be here. Nice to meet you, Dr. Stevenson. So I had a question. When you went through the process to educate yourself in the history, how do you cope with some of the emotions that are attached to that history while you're going through that process? And then even finding out, like, maybe some of these systems still currently being in place, how do you cope, deal with, emotionally respond to these things to be able to deliver such powerful messages?
It's really hard to learn the history. I've been studying it. I actually my mother used to teach me a lot of her family history from South Carolina. They were raised on a farm in which they had been enslaved. Her father had bought the farm, but her grandfather had bought the farm, but nonetheless it was the same space. The graveyard was there, all that kind of stuff. So I was kind of conditioned to hear the horror stories because my mother had taught them to us when we were growing up. But they are horror stories, and there's no way around it. And so, oftentimes, depending on the content of my lecture or whatever, I would give trigger warnings to people because sometimes, my students run out of the class, they're so upset. and all of that. So I think you have to just be really patient with yourself when you get to a part or point, you have to, go through it, and then you have to take a break from it. The interesting thing about history, no matter what histories you're looking at, is that there's always trauma and there's always joy, okay? And so sometimes you need to just take a break and write it, and focus on the joy. Like I wrote on slave weddings, for example, or people who successfully escaped and reestablished themselves. That's some of the places where people have children and they're so happy about it. And you do find records of this joy too. So you have to mix the ugly with the beauty. Sometimes I also think about now more when I write now. I write a lot about creativity, the creative nature of enslaved people, the books that they produced, for example, the clothing that they produced, the pottery that they produced. Looking at other kinds of ways of understanding their lives outside of and around the horror and the trauma of their lives. But it is very, very difficult. And whether or not, because I focus on African Americans, but I also focus on women's history. And whether or not, I do either one, I always find something horrific. And even when you're focusing on elite people, there are some horror stories. I remember there was the first book that I did, Life in Black and White, was about Northern Virginia, actually, enslaved families and white families, and free black families in Northern Virginia. And there was this one planter family, the Robert Conrad family, this white family, that I followed generation after generation. They had literally had tens of thousands of letters in the Virginia Historical Society. And his son went off to, he went to UVA, I went to UVA, and then his son was sent off to law school at Yale, and I went to Yale graduate school. So I was like, oh, this dude's, what did he say? We're doing some of the same things. And then his son got sick and died of dysentery. And I was so sad for the family. And I felt almost embarrassed that I was sad for them because they were slaveholders. But I felt sad for them, And so whatever you study, though, you're always going to find trauma and you're always going to find joy. And so I think it's trying to balance the two without dismissing the trauma and the horror. And I think it's what we have to aim for. Thank you for the question. It's an excellent question.
We've got time for one more question. If anyone else, raise your hand.
I'm so happy about Timothy Street. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
With his husband.
Oh, wonderful. Nice
You
to
said
meet
you have your husband here. My name's Josh. So this question is actually for your husband.
It's about getting in trouble, y'all.
And that is, how did you support, or how did he support you as you went through the journey of the history? And how did he care for you? How did he comfort you in those hard times? How did he encourage you to push through the heartache?
You are assuming a lot of stuff.
Okay.
No, my husband's fantastic. First of all, he's a PhD, so we were in graduate school at the same time, although he's a clinical psychologist and I'm a historian. And we actually met. We met at church at Yale. We actually met as undergraduates. I was at UVA, he was at the University of Richmond, and we had some friends in common, so we met that way. And then later on, when he was doing his internship at Yale, I was a graduate student at Yale, we met at church there. And then I came back to Richmond to do my dissertation research, and he was doing his PhD at Virginia Commonwealth University. We met again that way. So we've been in this endeavor of expanding our knowledge, and growing as professionals since we were in college, I guess, in a way. He talks to me, he's a clinical psychologist, so if I've got trauma, and he will reassure me that that's not his job. Next time he didn't get paid for it, it was a professional for him to counsel me, et cetera, et cetera. But he's always been interested in my work. You can see he's with me today. He comes with me when I've been overseas doing work. We were at Oxford for 2 years. He went with me to Oxford, and he was a psychologist at Oxford while I was a professor there. When I went to Germany, the American Academy in Berlin, he came to visit me and stay with me. So he's always been there if I had to go somewhere. Once our daughter went to college, then I felt free, I could travel, and he's always come to visit, and he didn't say you can't go there, you know, you can't do that, et cetera, et cetera. I can't say he reads what I write, okay? I have a very sneaky suspicion that he's never read anything. We're talking about 6 books, and he's never read them. But nonetheless, he's always allowed me to go off and do my research and present it, and to, you know, go places, which has been fantastic. Because I can't imagine if he had said no, what that meant too. So hang in there.
So
He wants to say something.
I just want to say, both of your questions, you and your wife, were talking about the personal experience of doing this work. And that's something that I remind her of, that, you know, it's a personal experience. And your own history, your own personal history is important. It's kind of, trauma is like a hazardous material. And the more you get exposed to it, sometimes you get too much and you got to back off. But we want to tell our stories. And we also don't want to tell our stories because it's very painful. Realizing that is really important. I've got a book that I'm working on. I'm looking at how people's talent is related to what they suffer from. So knowing that a person has talent, you're loving them partly because of their talent. You also have to look at the flip side of it. It comes often from a lot of suffering and misery. And we also have that. So if I want to squelch her and what she's doing, it's probably because of my own stuff. She likes whodunits. She likes murder mysteries. I can't stand it because it's too much for me. I spent 30, 40 years researching, or not researching, but talking to people about their suffering. I don't need it in my retirement. but it's part of what she's about, and I would want to support that.
You're here.
Thank you.
Again, I want to thank all of you all for coming out today, and I want to thank the museums of Portsmouth for having me. Dr. Hogan, thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you for our mayor for being here today, and for staying, and for all of you people for coming out, again, in the cold, but to learn about our history and hopefully to understand we've been through everything, we can survive everything. That's right. We have. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson, and we would like to thank everyone for coming out and attending our lecture today. Our next lecture in this series is going to take place in this room on February 21st at 1:30 p.m., where Mr. Charles Johnson presents the African American Historical Society of Portsmouth, Preserving a Community's History. We hope that you will join us for that exciting talk. Please remember there are refreshments in the nearby rotunda out to your left here. Don't forget to check out our new exhibit celebrating 100 years of Black History Month at the Portsmouth Colored Community Library Museum. And if you're looking for other history exhibits, we do have our America's Shipyard exhibit in the lobby here at the Welcome Center and a Seat of Justice at the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center. Thank you all again.